In the early 1970s, I found myself standing awkwardly in a room the size of a walk-in closet. This was my brother-in-law Alex's, what he called his study. And it was a walk-in closet with a door for a desk, and it was pretty cluttered, and I was uncomfortable for a bunch of reasons. One of them was I was standing there uncomfortably because there was no place to sit. There was hardly any place to stand. But another reason was he had this big display of his World War II medals. He'd been in the Army Air Corps in Second World War in the China, Burma, India theater. And he was a generation older than me. He was 21 years older than me. He was in his mid-40s at the time. I was in my mid-20s. And I was still coming out of the 60s. And I had a little bit of that post-teenage, early 20s arrogance. You know, he and my sister had not experienced the 60s the way I did. They were doing very ordinary things, like bringing up children, taking care of a house and a lawn. I was, organizing anti-war marches and protests and civil rights activities. I don't go back quite that far. Community organizing in North Philadelphia, and they did none of that. They just kind of had their 4 kids and lived in their split-level house, and so I didn't know this nonviolent anti-war protester didn't know quite what to make of this big display of World War II medals. I mean, I respected him and whatever he did to earn them, but I just didn't know how to fit them into my head. So that was the second reason why I was uncomfortable there. The third reason is that Alex was an engineer, an electrical engineer, and all the engineer stereotypes applied to him. He would withdraw from any kind of emotional conversation. He would sometimes have something. Well, whenever he spoke, it was endless. And it was about how something worked, which you really didn't care how it worked, but he had to explain. Or it was a really interesting story that would have been interesting if he could tell it with any inflection or emotion, and if he didn't just drone on and repeat himself indefinitely. So here I was, and he had asked me to stop up to his study before I left on that visit to their house. And I had no idea. He'd never asked me to do something like that. I had no idea what was going to happen. Was I going to get stuck there and miss my train? But actually he surprised me, and what he said was very simple and to the point. He said, when I moved to Philadelphia from New York, I really missed my little brother. And then you came into my life. He married my sister when I was 9 or 10. And you filled a need for me. And I want you to know that I will always be a brother or a father to you. And I really went, I don't know how to handle that, coming from the engineer. I'm not sure if I gave him a little hug, or I don't remember if I shook his hand or how I reacted to it. But it went over and over and over in my head on the train ride home to New York City for me at that time. And it stayed with me the rest of my life and to today. Now, 40 years later, I was also standing, not quite as uncomfortably because I had a chair to lean on, was at his graveside burial. And in the chair in front of me was his youngest daughter, Carol. And I could, I was emotionally in bad shape, but I wasn't as fidgety as I was that day in his study. In the meantime, over the 40 years in the meantime, of course, our relationship had deepened. He'd been there for me many times, and I had suffered through many of his retellings of his one World War II story. It was always the same story, and he always told it, and he didn't tell it well, but I'll tell it very simply, and you'll understand it. See, they did a lot of ferrying of livestock on planes in the China, Burma, India theater. They were often ferrying livestock for Chinese guerrillas. And so he was a radio operator, PFC, private first class radio operator. And, he was often in planes full of livestock. Fortunately, he had no sense of smell. So he didn't mind it, but he found it amusing. And on one of those trips, they were ferrying 5 mules somewhere. And somehow during the trip, the mules had become untethered. So when they came in for a landing and the pilot approached the landing strip, all of the mules slid forward and the nose of the plane went straight down. So the pilot had to quickly abort the landing, pull back up, but all of the mules slid to the back of the plane and the nose flipped up. So the pilot had to go around the mountain and in an unconventional, very level landing, managed to land without displacing the live cargo. And that was it. That was the story. That was all he ever talked about World War II. So here I am 40 years later, and as the years went on, now I was in my 60s, my sister was in her 70s, he was in his 80s. Every time I left their house, I wondered what would happen when one of them died, how I would live without them. They were what I had left in the world in terms of family outside of my own immediate new family. And then one Monday night in September 2010, I got a phone call from my older niece, Linda, telling me there had been a terrible automobile accident. And I knew from her voice right away that neither of them would survive. And then she told me, Mom didn't make it to the hospital. Mom didn't make it to the hospital. So I knew my sister had been declared dead at the scene. And I knew I would find out later that evening that Alex's injuries were described as not survivable. But I got in the car and I drove up. He had been taken to a trauma center in Delaware. And I drove through the night, got there just before midnight and just after he died, so that his hand was still warm when I held it. And that was followed by a funeral in a Reformed Jewish temple, and then a burial in a Jewish cemetery. But Alex got full military honors. The family decided to forego the 21-gun salute, but he got the rest of it, which was appropriate for a guy who still, to the day he died, carried his discharge papers in his pocket. He was 85 or 86 when he died, and he still carried his discharge papers. And he got the full military burial. And so I was there, graveside, standing behind my younger niece, Carol, as the leader of the honor guard folded the flag, and I didn't realize she had been designated to be the recipient well, he didn't fold it, he received the flag. And I didn't realize that she had been designated as the recipient of the flag. But I was standing there as he stood perfectly at attention with unwavering stare and with the sincerest, strongest tone I can imagine, said, "This flag is presented on behalf of a grateful nation and the United States Army as a token of our appreciation for your loved ones' honorable and faithful service." Afterwards, members of the immediate family got one of these, a replica of his distinguished flying cross, which remains an important memento for me today. So this former anti-war protester grew to appreciate the medal, appreciate my brother-in-law's service, and appreciate his love over the years.